Hi. Um, so my name is Modupe Akinnawonu, and today I'm here to talk to you about how to manage user feedback in public forums, how to set expectations for your users, and how to translate the feedback you're getting into features for them. So before we get started, a little bit about me. So I am currently a product manager at the New York Times. I've been doing that for about the last 4 years. Before I was a product manager, I was still at the Times as a liaison between our customer service team and the mobile teams that build our apps. And so I was bringing my past customer service experience into the New York Times and helping the mobile teams figure out how to build their products better. I also, during this time, have worked as a teaching assistant for an organization called General Assembly. So for those of you who aren't familiar with GA, it's an organization that has lots of ways for people to learn new things. Most of those things are tech-related, are tech-specific or tech-adjacent. So they'll have front and back-end coding classes, but also things like product management and marketing in digital organizations. And so I've been a teaching assistant for the product classes at GA. And so that's given me a bit of experience in how to help new people learn concepts that they were otherwise not familiar with when it comes to product. So what are you going to get out of this talk today? The first thing you're going to get is why you should care about how you interact with your users in public and not just allow the public square to have their say and however they feel about your product and you not really interacting with them. The next thing you're going to get is some approaches for how to interact with those users based on what we're already doing at the New York Times on our Android team. And the last thing you're going to get out of this talk is tips for figuring out what to build for those people based on that feedback that you're getting. So, as we're all aware, there are a variety of ways for users to give us feedback in public. A lot of that has to do with social media. Twitter is a great example of how you might get feedback from your users, or from the Google Play Store in the reviews that they leave for you. Or if you happen to put your product on Product Hunt, there are ways for people to leave comments and thus have a communal way of communicating their feedback. But it's good to remember that really there is no private feedback with your users. Even if they are calling you or calling your customer service organization or sending you emails, even in those cases, those things can become public. And so it's very important to always be aware of how you're interacting with your users, because any of those things could become things that are known to just about anybody who's interested in learning more about you. At the New York Times specifically, the Android team's public feedback mostly sits in the realm of the Google Play Store and our Google Plus page for our public beta. And so, as most of you are aware, the Play Store allows for you to interact with users and respond to their feedback. And so that becomes a way for people who don't go after you directly to figure out what kinds of ways does that company answer these questions. And then if you have a Google Plus group for your product, it's a very forum-based thing, and that allows for the other users who are also in the Google Plus group to give you feedback. And so the New York Times actively engages with our users in both of these forums. Twitter is obviously a really important place where people give feedback, but for the Times specifically, most of our Twitter feedback ends up being generally about the New York Times as a whole or about our coverage, and less specifically about the Android app, which gives us less of a way for us to address that specific feedback. So, why should you care about the feedback that you get from users in these forums? One important reason is for brand purposes. The way in which you give that feedback can be a really great expression of the brand of your product. So here we have a fantastic example, in my opinion, from Slack. Your error messages are one of the important ways in which your users interact with you. They should be thoughtful. They shouldn't just be throwaways of you've gotten an error and there's nothing that you can do about it. As much as possible, those error messages should give a way for people to get out of those problems. But it's a really great place for, if your product has a voice and a way in which it particularly communicates with your users, you integrate that into here as well. So here in the Slack example, there's been some sort of error based on connectivity. And if you look at the second sentence in this error message, it says, we've seen this problem clear up with a restart of Slack, a solution which we suggest to you now only with great regret and self-loathing. So that's a great way for Slack to kind of inject their brand of humor into the error message they're giving to their users and continue to preserve their brand in this form of communication. Another reason to care a lot about the public feedback that you get from users is it can be a great place for you to get insights on your product and how you should move forward. But we'll come back to this, more on that later. So let's talk about users. The Nielsen-Norman Group did a study where they measured the computer literacy of adults in the OECD between 2011 and 2015. And so here they're looking at adults who are ages 16 to 65, so it doesn't even include the oldest among us who have even lower computer skills on average than you would see in this chart. But what you can see here is that in this bottom 80% in the gray, you've got a sizable chunk of people, even in these technically forward and should be relatively computer literate countries, where a sizable portion of the adult population just can't use computers at all. And then in the red and the yellow, you see people who have what this study calls below 1 or terrible computer skills, or level 1 or poor computer skills. And in these cases, these users can only do relatively simple tasks. You give them one task to do. They don't have to pull in outside information. They don't have to use implicit information that's not entirely obvious to do a task or solve a problem. The vast majority of people in this room, and many of the people that you work with, are sitting in the green area at the top of the screen, where their computer skills are strong. But this is only 5 to 8% of the population. And it can be really easy to forget that this is what the world actually looks like, because most of the people we work with sit in that 5 to 8%. And this can cause us to think about the ways in which we're solving problems in a way that solves it for people who are far more tech literate than our user base might be. So I remember when I first read this article, I was shocked. I was so surprised at what these numbers actually were, because it doesn't, even though I knew our group of users had a big spectrum of their computer skills, I didn't realize just how bad it was and just how much the kinds of things we ask users to do may not meet their technical ability at that moment, because we make a lot of assumptions about what people may or may not know. So that brings me to this really important point. You are not your users. And this is true no matter how technical your users are. So even if you're in a situation where you're a developer building things for other developers, and you're building things for other people who are sitting in this 5 to 8% of tech skills, it's still really important to remember that you have way more context for what this product is and how it's supposed to work than any of the people outside of your company who are using this product. Even if it comes to something that, if you know Java really well and other people know Java really well, they should be able to just get it. There are lots of things you know about errors that you know you're going to fix later. And so when you're going through the product yourself, you know how to get around the problem, or you can tolerate an issue because in a week it'll be fixed, but your users don't know that. And so it's really important to remember while you're developing that they don't have any of the context that you do, and that you are not your users, and you need to understand who your users are in order to build for them effectively. So now let's get into how to manage criticism from these users in public forums. And we're mostly going to be using the tools that the New York Times mostly gets these from for our Android team, as I mentioned before, Google Play and Google+. So the first thing you want to do is assume that your users are operating in good faith. It's really easy to get frustrated if you get the same feedback from people over and over, or you get feedback that doesn't understand some constraint that your company has, and that's the reason why something has to work the way it does. Maybe there's another stakeholder like marketing that has particular sway over something, and so something must be done a particular way. Or you had to make a decision because it only affects a small number of users, and so the people who are affected are going to be particularly upset. So if you just come at it from the perspective of these users are not out to get you, they just want to communicate their problems to you so that you can fix them, because the only way for their problems to get fixed is for them to tell you about it. It can make it easier for you to not take the criticism as personally and just handle it as it comes. So in this specific instance, we had a user asking the New York Times to restore night mode to our apps. For those who are unfamiliar, night mode is when you kind of invert the colors and you've got a dark background with light colored writing instead of a light background with dark colored writing, which is the default in most cases. And so they were asking for us to bring that back. It was a complaint we heard over and over and over for the approximate year and a half, where the feature was removed from the app in our rewrite before it was restored. And so it's really easy to get really frustrated, but if you remember they're operating in good faith, that can help you when you're responding to these kinds of questions. Next thing to remember is to always troubleshoot without condescension. If you try to remove the default of the users having a problem because it's user error, and instead just think, what is the information I need to get from this person in order to better understand exactly what's going on here? Remove as much of the arrogance and condescension as you can from your response so that you can continue to have them believe that you're also operating in good faith and more likely to elicit useful information in that continuous response from that user. So in this case, somebody reported a crash in the Google Play Store, and so we just responded, we're sorry to hear about that, and asked them for details for more information to figure out exactly what was going on when this crash happened. Next thing you want to remember is to always be really curious about your users. When you hear feedback that is strange or doesn't make a whole lot of sense or prompts you to think of more questions, ask your users what they're thinking about. Try not to make too many assumptions if it's something where you want to dig more into why they're making the comment that they're making. So in this specific case, somebody was giving us information about top stories, so our feed of top news of the day. They didn't like how it was being organized, and they had some opinions about it. And you could just let the opinion sit in the Play Store, or you could be curious and take this opportunity to ask them more questions and encourage them to give you more information about why they're saying the things that they're saying, because that could reveal insights that you wouldn't have thought to even ask them about that could then make your products better. In another example, here, it's a little hard to read, but the entire review is simply, UX is definitely not on their priority list. I can assure you that UX is definitely on the priority list of the New York Times. So instead of just letting this comment just sit there in the ether, it's really important to me that we reach out to the user or encourage them to reach out to us so I could get more information, so I could understand, is this a product of a misunderstanding of how our product works? Is there something about onboarding that doesn't help them understand how to use the app? Is there something about the gestures or the design patterns that we used that made this confusing? If I don't prompt for more information, there's no way for me to figure out if this is just someone who's being really salty and leaving a random review because they can, or somebody who has really interesting insights that could then help me make my product better. And so in this case, we asked them to email our customer care alias so we could get more information about why they left a comment like this with no more details. It's really important to try and be humble and try to operate with humility when you are interacting with your users. If a problem has come up, a lot of people just want their problem acknowledged. They don't want to hear that you can't reproduce it. They don't want to hear that no one else is having this issue. They want acknowledgement that they are not crazy and that their problems are real. And if it is a thing that is your fault, a small apology goes a long way to help people feel like you actually care about your users, you actually care about their experience, and you are trying to make it better for them. So if you can apologize because it is your fault, because you did introduce that bug into your app, just say sorry. A lot of people will really appreciate that. Try to keep in mind that you should be as honest as you can be. Users are really curious about the decisions that go into the products that they use. And sometimes when they're not curious, finding out more information about why they're having an issue can be very helpful to them and can be helpful in kind of tempering their patience for the issues that are going on. And so while it's true that there's lots of information that you can't tell your users, there's lots of things about your product that you could tell if somebody asked you. And so if you have an opportunity to be honest about why this thing is delayed in a way that isn't going to give away trade secrets and isn't going to make them even angrier, so keep that in mind as well, try to give them the context for why what is happening is happening. I have found sometimes that when really loud and upset users are told that, hey, the thing that you want, here's why we can't do it right now, or here's why we worked on these other things, because it turns out you're a minority and most people don't think the way you do, or most people don't use the product the way you do. That can sometimes mollify those hard feelings about why their specific thing isn't being addressed right now. As much as you can, address the criticism that you're receiving, even if you can't do much about it right now. So this is not necessarily a universal, you should respond to every bad message that you get with more information, because sometimes all that's going to do is inflame the situation, and sometimes you're dealing with a situation where the problem is outside of the scope of your ability to fix it, and there's no real way to say that without throwing the wrong person under the bus. But when you can, try to address the criticism that you're receiving, even if it's not true that you're fixing the bug tomorrow. Sometimes it's good to even say, hey, this is on our roadmap for the quarter. I know it's a little while before we'll be able to get to it, but it is something we care about. It is something we're thinking about. Thank you for your feedback. So just a little bit of that can go a long way in helping mollify your users. And the last thing to remember, don't feed the trolls. There are some people who are operating in bad faith. You can make the assumption that most people are doing good things, but sometimes you can tell right away that this isn't a person who's actually looking to be helpful to you. And so we get reviews like this all the time in the Play Store. If you can't read it, it says, extremely biased app, the failing New York Times is fake news. So we've been getting all sorts of stuff like this over the last couple of years. This is not a place where engaging with the trolls is going to be helpful to us or helpful to them or helpful to anyone else who's reading these reviews in the Play Store, because you just set yourself in a situation where you're going to get into an argument match. So if you're getting somebody who is clearly operating in very bad faith, just don't feed the trolls and don't respond. So after seeing some of those examples and seeing that users are reaching out to you, asking for you to do certain things or complaining about certain features, how do you figure out what that audience actually wants? Because what people say is not always what they want. And that's a really important thing to remember in taking in qualitative feedback and trying to figure out how to continue to build your product with it. So the first thing to remember is that statistics only tell part of the story. So as I had mentioned in one of those reviews from a few slides ago, we got lots of complaints from people for removing night mode from our app. So the reason why we did it is in 2014, while we were deciding to embark on a total rewrite of our Android app, so that we could start over, we could start using more modern patterns, we could get rid of a lot of tech debt that had been building up over several years. We realized that if we wanted to not have this project take a whole year and try to get it out in the approximate 6-month time frame that we wanted to give ourselves, that there were going to have to be some features that weren't going to make the first launch, that we were going to take time afterwards to slowly build it back into our product so that we could limit the scope, make this easier to build, make this faster to build, and not leave people with the broken old experience for this extended period of time. Now that we've acknowledged that there are problems there, we're going to stop fixing the problems there, and we're going to rewrite the app. And so we looked at our numbers, and our numbers told us that night mode was used by just about no one. The percentages were tiny. It wasn't going to be something that, it was going to be missed by the people who use it, obviously. And at the time, I was a person who basically used our app in night mode at all times, day or night. But it was something we could live with for a little while, because the effort of designing everything twice and implementing all of those designs twice in order to build in night mode was something that was going to take more time than we wanted for doing the first launch. But what we failed to consider is the degree to which night mode usage being low was because of where night mode was in our settings. It was relatively difficult to find. So the percentages were small, maybe not because people didn't want to use night mode, but maybe instead because people couldn't find it. And in that case, looking at those numbers won't tell you the whole story. It also didn't tell us how passionate these users would be about the fact that night mode was missing. So for the entire time after we launched, for about a year and a half, every day in the Google Play Store, or in other online forums, or in our inbox for email feedback, we would hear from somebody who was asking about why night mode was missing, the fact that it was a really important part of how they use the app, and the fact that it was something that made it pretty fundamental to the reading experience. And so numbers can tell you really important stories about what you should focus on, but they don't necessarily give you the whole story. So always remember to put those numbers in the context of your product and really think about whether or not there's more information here that you need to make decisions about what kind of products to build. Next thing that's really important is for you to understand your demographics. It can be too easy to make all sorts of assumptions about what you should build and how you should build it based on your own team and based on some more limited knowledge of the world. What you really need is to understand who your actual users are. Are there some people who are more inclined to spend more money, and thus there are particular ways in which you might build if you know that? Are there some users who will always be more casual, but there are specific things that you can do to move them towards a more engaged person who is using your product? Understanding who these people are and the ways in which they use your product and the context in which they live are super, 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 super important to your process. But knowing that, how do you figure out what this information is? Some of us work at companies with large research teams who can help us figure this out, but some of us don't. Some of us work in small shops where it's just a handful of engineers and a few other people, and we don't necessarily have this wealth of knowledge for how to understand who our users are. So how do we do that? First thing you want to do is talk to your users. And so you don't have to have this big dedicated research team in order to engage with them. There are all sorts of places where you can find these people to talk to, and thus try to integrate a more consistent way for you to continuously get feedback from real people that's not just in numbers forms. You can look at the people who are contacting your customer service team, if you have one, and take the people who are giving you insightful comments or who are really revealing their pain points to you and get in contact with them and ask them questions. People love to talk about themselves, and they love to talk about why you should care about the way they use your product. And so you're going to find eager people if you reach out to the people who bothered to take the time to reach out to you. You could go look in forums, whether it's a public forum that you set up for your product or a forum for some other product or forum for a competitor's product, to go find other people who might fit the demographics you're looking for and get more information. If you're a company that takes in information from other vendors, you can talk to those vendors and might be able to get useful information that way. If you don't have a way to talk to people outside of your company, or you're working on something that's still in stealth mode and so you can't talk about it with people outside of your company in a reasonable way, go talk to your coworkers. Go try and find people who are allowed to know about what you're working on, but aren't the people working on it, so that you can use them as a proxy, so that you could dog food your product and find out more information about how they think and feel about the situation. And if all else fails, go talk to your friends and family. They're not necessarily going to be as close to your target user as you want them to be, but that can even just be the spark of starting to figure out what sorts of insights should I pay attention to, what kind of decisions should I be making, and how do I move forward in a more useful way for my product. One thing to really remember when you are talking to your users is to be really careful about not biasing the kinds of questions that you ask. So I don't have details about it in this talk, but it behooves you to, if you're going to be taking this approach and you're going to be talking to users, to understand how to ask them questions. And so, for example, you don't want to ask a user, do you like this? Or does this bother you? Instead, you might want to place them into a situation. So say you're creating an exercise app. Instead of asking people, how often do you exercise? Because your users will often lie to you if the kinds of questions you're asking them are things that have a particular answer that makes them look good versus what might be the true answer. In that case, you would ask them, okay, think about the last week. Tell me how many times you went to the gym. What prompted your decision to go to the gym? Why did you use this other form of exercise during the week? And so asking more neutral things that put them in a particular context of think back to stuff you have already done versus would you do this? Would you try this? Is more likely to elicit unbiased answers that are more honest. And the last thing I'm going to talk about today is before you build something, ask why users want it, and then ask again. It's really easy for the feedback that comes to you to be in the form of, you should build this particular thing, versus I am having this particular problem. And in some of those cases, taking that idea and just building it into your product makes a ton of sense. But there are also lots of situations where a user is giving you feedback based on the knowledge that they have about how the world works and how your product works, and they don't necessarily have all the information to know there are other solutions to this problem that might be better for both them and for your overall audience. So when you get feedback of build this thing, question it. Think about, why did the user ask me for this particular thing? What their problem actually might be if they just ask for a feature versus complaining about something. And how do I want to go about bringing that into my product? So in this specific example from the Times, we got a question from a user asking us to remove all of the images from our section fronts. So the images were big, and I would like a text-only version of the app with no photos. But what we wouldn't have known if we hadn't probed more is that their issue isn't really that they don't want photos and they don't like looking at photos. Their issue was that the app was using too much data. And the user thought, hey, this is a way I've solved this problem in the past in a lot of other products. I just turned off the images and don't allow those images to come through. So they asked us to remove the images, but that's not their real problem. So by probing a little deeper and getting a better understanding of why they're having the issue that they're having, we were able to figure out data management is the way to go. Let's fix our data management problems so that these users can continue to enjoy both images and text. So I really hope from today's talk you've taken away lots of ways that you can think about interacting with your users and a few concrete things you can do to change the way you're doing this in the future and better figure out how to build on top of what you already have to make your products even better. Thank you.